The moment. Margaret Lyle Dutton walked into the Red Valley General Store with her daughter Clara, every head turned, not in admiration, but in the particular way small towns have of making a person feel like an inconvenience. Clara was 26 years old. She was broad-shouldered and full-figured, with flour on her apron and a smudge of something dark near her left temple. She carried two baskets and held the door open for her mother, who swept in ahead of her without a word of thanks. Harold Finch, who owned the feed store next door and considered himself the unofficial voice of Red Valley, leaned across the counter toward his wife. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. "Lord," he said, "she's gotten bigger again. Who in the world would take that on?" His wife pressed her lips together in a smile she didn't bother hiding. Clara heard him. She always heard them. She set her baskets down on the counter and asked for 2 pounds of salt and a spool of brown thread. And she kept her face perfectly still while her chest did what it always did in those moments. Tightened like a fist, then slowly opened again. This was the skill she had developed over 26 years. The skill of surviving rooms like this one. What she could not have known, standing in that store with flour on her apron and Harold Finch's laughter still hanging in the air, was that 3 miles away, a man named Ethan Blackwood was telling his ranch foreman that he intended to send a letter to the Dutton family, and that the letter would change every single thing that happened next. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the air shift against you, then you already know this woman. Stay with her, subscribe if you haven't yet, and hit that like button so this story can travel as far as Clara's courage did. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be heard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Dutton read it twice at the kitchen table, then set it down and looked at her daughter with an expression Clara had never quite seen before, something caught between calculation and relief. "Ethan Blackwood wants to meet you," Margaret said. Clara was rolling out biscuit dough. She didn't stop. "Meet me for what?" "With the intention of marriage." The rolling pin stilled. Clara looked up. Her mother was already smoothing the letter, refolding it along its creases with the careful attention she rarely gave to anything involving her daughter. "He's very specific," Margaret continued. "He says he's looking for a woman of practical character, someone capable of managing a large household. He mentions good sense over appearances." She paused. He was apparently quite deliberate in his request. "He asked for me specifically?" "He asked through Reverend Callow, who recommended you." Margaret set the letter down. "I don't know why Callow would do that, but here we are." Clara turned this over. Reverend Callow had known her since she was 12. He had watched her nurse her father through 2 winters of illness. He had watched her keep the household running when her mother's grief made her useless for months at a stretch. He had watched a lot, Reverend Callow. Apparently he had also talked. "What do you think?" Clara asked. Her mother stood and moved to the window. Outside, the dusty yard baked in afternoon heat. "I think Ethan Blackwood is the wealthiest man in 3 counties and owns more land than some towns." She didn't turn around. "I think you are 26 years old, Clara. I think no one else has asked." There it was. The thing that lived under every conversation in this house, never named until it was useful as a weapon. Clara pulled the biscuit dough into a ball, pressed it flat, and began again. "All right," she said. "Tell Reverend Callow I'll meet him." The meeting happened at the Reverend's home, not at the ranch. That had been Ethan Blackwood's suggestion, and Clara appreciated it more than she expected to. It meant he understood that a woman agreeing to meet a stranger needed the advantage of neutral ground. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and too warm for the season, and she sat across from a man who was nothing like what she'd imagined. She had pictured someone older, someone soft with money and comfort, the kind of man who bought things because he could and expected them to perform accordingly. She had prepared herself for that man, for the flatness of being assessed and found adequate enough. Ethan Blackwood was 41, lean in the way of men who worked their own land alongside their hired hands. His face had the kind of weathering that came from years outdoors, with lines around his eyes that could have been sun or could have been something heavier. His hands, resting on the table, were not soft. He wore a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked at her the way people looked at things they were genuinely trying to understand, not categorize. "Miss Dutton," he said, "thank you for coming." Mr. Blackwood. She folded her hands in her lap. I'll tell you honestly, I don't entirely know what I'm doing here. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, more like attention sharpening. Neither do I, if we're being honest. I've had this conversation twice before and it went very badly both times. I thought a third attempt might as well start with the truth. What's the truth? He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I need someone capable, not decorative. I have a ranch that requires real management. I have workers who need fair treatment, and a household that's been running poorly for 3 years since my housekeeper left. I'm not looking for a companion who'll sit in the parlor. I'm looking for a partner. And Reverend Callow thought of me. He said you kept your family running through circumstances that would have collapsed most people. He said you were the kind of woman who solved problems quietly and didn't need credit for it. Ethan paused. He said the town doesn't see you clearly. Clara held his gaze. The town sees me fine. They just don't like what they see. Ethan nodded, slowly. I know something about that. It was such a simple thing to say, but something in the way he said it, without performance, without the particular gentleness people used when they wanted her to feel better, made her believe him. They talked for 2 hours, about the ranch, about what managing it actually required, about the workers and the land and the cattle operation and the 3-county water agreement that was currently in dispute. He asked her questions and listened to her answers with the kind of focus that felt, after a lifetime of being talked over, almost disorienting. When she left, she sat in the wagon for a long moment before picking up the reins. She thought, this might be the strangest conversation I've ever had. She thought, I think I'm going to say yes. She said yes, and Red Valley lost its mind, not loudly, not in any organized fashion, but in the particular way small communities process information that doesn't fit their expectations. In pieces, over time, with a gathering momentum that Clara felt even before the news had fully spread. At the dry goods store, did you hear? Blackwood is marrying the Dutton girl, the big one. At the feed lot, 3 men laughing over something one of them said, and falling quiet when Clara walked past with her mother. At the church social, 2 weeks before the wedding, Mrs. Hargrove pulling Margaret aside and saying, in a tone she thought was kind, well, I suppose even Clara deserves some luck. As though marriage to a good man was a lottery Clara had won through chance rather than character. Clara stood beside the lemonade table and listened to the calculations people made about her life. They decided Ethan must feel sorry for her. They decided she must have had something to do with it, pushed for it somehow, manipulated Callow's recommendation. Some of the women decided she must be pregnant, because what other explanation was there? A man like Ethan Blackwood did not choose a woman like Clara Dutton unless something had gone wrong somewhere. The one thing no one considered was the simplest, that he had met her, talked to her, and made a decision based on what he found. Clara's younger sister, Nora, came to her room the night before the wedding and sat on the edge of the bed the way she had when they were children. You nervous? Nora asked. Yes, Clara said. She was honest with Nora in a way she wasn't with most people. About him? About all of it. Clara set down the brush she'd been running through her hair. About getting something wrong. About not being what he needs. About... She stopped. About people watching you fail, Nora said quietly. Clara looked at her sister. About that? Yes. Nora reached over and took her hand. You're the most capable person I know, Clara. I've known that since I was 6 years old, watching you talk Papa through one of his bad spells while Mama was crying in the kitchen. You were 14. She squeezed her hand. Ethan Blackwood is getting something better than he knows. That's the truth. Clara squeezed back. She didn't say, what if I can't be enough? She didn't say, what if they're right? She'd spent 26 years not saying those things out loud, and she wasn't going to start the night before her wedding. She said, thank you, Nora. And then she sat there in the quiet of her childhood bedroom for a while longer, holding her sister's hand in the dark. The Blackwood Ranch sat on a rise 3 miles southeast of Red Valley, and when Clara first saw it in the full light of morning, her wedding morning, the wagon carrying her and her small trunk of belongings, she felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. It was large. She'd known that in the abstract, but abstract knowledge and the physical reality of the main house, the 3 outbuildings, the bunkhouse, the barn, the fencing that seemed to go on past the point where she could reasonably track it. Those were different things. She had a moment, sitting in that wagon, of pure unguarded fear. the kind that doesn't announce itself elegantly but just sits in the stomach like a stone. Then she picked up her trunk and climbed down. The wedding was small. Reverend Callow, a handful of Ethan's hands who stood respectfully near the fence, Nora and her mother, and two of Ethan's distant neighbors who Clara understood were present mainly out of curiosity. Ethan stood at the front of the small parlor in a clean shirt and dark jacket and looked at her the way he'd looked at her during their meeting, with attention, not performance. She stood beside him and said the words and meant the ones that seemed meanable and reserved judgment on the rest. Afterward, Mrs. Crenshaw, the woman who cooked for the ranch, served a simple meal in the kitchen, and Clara sat at a table full of people who were strangers and ate quietly and listened. One of the hands, a younger man named Diego, made a joke about the barn cat that made two people laugh genuinely, and Clara found herself smiling at the table without thinking about it. It was such a small thing, a shared laugh over a barn cat, but it felt like the first solid thing she'd touched in weeks. The first test came faster than she expected. 3 days after the wedding, she was in the kitchen with Mrs. Crenshaw when she overheard two of the hands outside the window. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply went still, the way she'd learned to go still in rooms where people forgot she was present. "You see the new wife? Hard to miss her." A pause, then the sound of something being dragged. "Wonder how long before Blackwood figures out what he actually brought home. Give it a month. She'll be back in town crying to her mama." Clara stood at the counter with a jar of preserved peaches in her hand and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The fist. She waited for it to open. It opened. She put the peaches down, went to the back door, and stepped outside. Both men startled. They were moving fence posts. One of them was named Rollins, she'd been told, and the younger one she didn't know yet. "Good morning," she said. "I'm going to need help moving the supply inventory from the front storeroom to the dry cellar before the heat gets worse this week. I'd like to start this afternoon." Rollins looked at her with a flat expression. "That's usually Diego's job." "Diego is repairing the east fence line until Thursday, Mr. Rollins. So this afternoon it's ours." She kept her voice level and her face pleasant. 2:00. She went back inside. Mrs. Crenshaw, who was 63 and had been cooking for this ranch for 11 years, and had the kind of face that rarely expressed surprise, looked up from the stove. "They were talking about you," she said. Not a question. "They were," Clara agreed. She picked up the peaches again. "You going to tell Mr. Blackwood?" Clara considered this. "If the same problem comes up again, yes. Once isn't a problem. Once is just people figuring out who I am." She set the jar on the shelf. "I'd rather show them than tell them." Mrs. Crenshaw made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite approval, but was something in that vicinity. At 2:00, Rollins and the younger hand appeared at the storeroom. They worked without conversation. The work got done. But by the end of the first week, Clara had mapped the household. Not literally, though she would do that too eventually, in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, but in the way she'd always mapped environments, by watching, listening, and filing away the small things that told her how a place actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. She learned that the dry cellar flooded when rain came from the northwest because of a drainage problem no one had addressed for 2 years. She learned that the kitchen accounts were running at a loss because Mrs. Crenshaw was feeding the hands generously without anyone adjusting the supply orders. She learned that there was a gelding in the barn with a hoof problem that had been noted in a log and then seemingly forgotten. She brought the gelding problem to Ethan at dinner on Thursday. He looked up from his plate. "I didn't know about the hoof. It was in the log from 3 weeks ago. Whoever noted it didn't follow up." He set down his fork. "Which horse?" "The gray one. Second stall." He pushed back his chair. She thought he was going to go to the barn right then, and he did, without finishing his meal, and she ate the rest of hers alone at the table and found she didn't mind. That was a man who cared about his animals. She filed that away too. When he came back, he sat down across from her again and picked up his fork. "You found that in 3 days, he said. "I looked at the logs. Someone had to. No one else thought to." He ate for a moment. "I'm not sure if that's a problem with me for not assigning it or a problem with the system." "Probably both," she said. He looked at her. She felt the brief instinct to soften it, to say something that would make it less direct, less like a woman who'd been in his house a week telling him how his operation ran. 26 years of training said, smooth it over. Make it easy to hear. She didn't. The log system works if someone reads it consistently, she said. Right now it's used for recording and not much else. If you want, I can take it over. Ethan considered this. Then, all right. It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't warmth. It was simply the response of a man who recognized a reasonable offer and accepted it without performance. She thought, good, Huab. The second week brought the first real opposition, and it came from a direction she should have anticipated but hadn't focused on. Doris Hale arrived on horseback on a Wednesday morning, dressed in a riding habit that cost more than most people's month's wages, with her daughter Adelaide hanging slightly behind her. Doris was the wife of Warren Hale, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the territory and had reportedly been a suitor for Clara's position, or rather, for Ethan's resources and the potential of a different, more strategically advantageous alliance. Clara was in the yard when they arrived, and she was wearing her work apron and had been checking the drainage situation near the cellar. She had dirt on her hands. She did not apologize for this. Mrs. Blackwood, Doris said, and the title came out with a particular flavor. Not quite contemptuous, but not quite not. I thought I'd call and welcome you properly. Thank you, Clara said. Please come inside. In the parlor, Doris looked at everything in the way of someone running an inventory. Adelaide sat quietly and looked at her hands. Clara asked Mrs. Crenshaw for coffee. You've settled in quickly, Doris said. It must be very different from what you're used to. My family home was smaller, Clara said. The work isn't so different. Of course. A smile. I'm sure you'll find the social responsibilities more of an adjustment. Ethan entertains quite frequently in the fall. Dinners for buyers, that sort of thing. It requires a particular kind of preparation. Clara understood perfectly what she meant. She met Doris's eyes and held them. I'm looking forward to it, she said. Something moved in Doris Hale's expression, a small recalibration. She had expected, Clara understood, either defensiveness or anxiety, and had gotten neither, Adelaide said suddenly and clearly without intending to speak. Your cellar drainage problem is probably a pipe angle. Papa had the same thing until he had someone reroute it 2 summers ago. Both women looked at her. Adelaide went slightly pink. Sorry, she said. I heard you mention it when we came in, and… No, Clara said. Tell me what your father did. Adelaide blinked. Then carefully at first and then with more confidence, she explained what she remembered about the repair. Clara asked questions. Adelaide answered them. By the time the coffee was finished, they had sketched the rough approach on the back of an envelope. Doris Hale left with an expression Clara couldn't entirely read, but Adelaide at the door said, I'll have Papa send over the name of the man who did it, if you like. I'd appreciate that, Clara said, and meant it. Ethan came home that evening to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table with the account ledgers, the ranch log, and the drainage envelope, and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Doris Hale visited, Clara said, without looking up. I heard. She's testing me. Yes. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, not looking at the ledgers, looking at her. I should have warned you about that. It's all right. I've been tested before. She finally looked up. Her daughter might be an ally. Adelaide's sharp. She's just not allowed to be very often. Ethan's expression shifted. You got all that in one visit. I've been watching people my whole life, Clara said. It's what you do when they're not particularly interested in watching you back. There was a pause. Something settled in the kitchen that felt different from the careful, practical exchanges they'd had all week. Not warm, exactly. Not yet, but less provisional. Less like 2 people in a negotiation and more like 2 people beginning to learn the territory of each other. The ledgers are off, she said. The supply expenditures don't match the actual inventory. Either something is being recorded wrong or something is going somewhere it shouldn't. Ethan's face tightened. How far off? I don't know yet. I'd need 2 more days to track it properly, but it's enough to notice. Track it, he said. Quiet. The voice of someone containing a reaction. I will. She paused. If it's a recording error, it's easily fixed. If it's something else, then we deal with that. He stood. Thank you for looking. He went to the washstand and she went back to the ledgers, and neither of them said anything more that night. But when she finally blew out the lamp and carried her cold tea to the kitchen, She stood at the window for a moment in the dark. She thought about what she'd said to him. "I've been watching people my whole life. It's what you do when they're not interested in watching you back." She thought about the way he'd heard it. Not as complaint, not as bid for sympathy, just as fact. She thought, he listened to that the way a person listens to something they already understand. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she filed it away, the way she filed away everything, carefully, for later, when she had more of the picture. Outside, somewhere in the dark past the barn, a coyote called once and went quiet. Clara stood at the window a moment longer. Then she went to bed. On the 12th day, she found the discrepancy. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a moment of revelation. It was Tuesday morning, before the house was fully awake, and she was cross-referencing the feed purchase receipts against the ledger entries, and she found a difference. Then she found it again. Then she traced it backward through 6 months of records and found that someone had been skimming supply purchases. Small amounts, never enough to be obvious in any given month, but consistent and accumulating. She sat with the evidence for a long time. Then she made a list. Names of suppliers, dates of purchases, the discrepancy amounts, a running total that, over 6 months, amounted to something significant. She was still sitting with it when Ethan came downstairs. He looked at her face before he looked at the papers. "What is it?" "I need you to look at something," she said, "and I need you to be calm when you look at it." He sat down. She walked him through it. He was quiet the entire time. The particular quiet of a man running the calculations himself, checking her work in his head, arriving at the same conclusions. She watched his jaw tighten and loosen and tighten again. When she finished, he said, "Rollins." "I think so. The timing aligns with his handling of the supply account, but I can't be certain yet." "How long to be certain?" "Another week, maybe less if you can get the originals from the supplier in town." He nodded, still that quiet. "You've been doing this for a week and a half." "I've been looking at the records since the second day." "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure," she said, "and I didn't want to accuse anyone without being sure." Ethan looked at her across the table. His coffee sat untouched and going cold. "I hired Rollins 4 years ago," he said. It wasn't an excuse or a defense. It was just a man sitting with something he hadn't seen. "He's good at his job," Clara said. "That's probably how he thought he'd earned it." "That's not how earning works." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Outside, they could hear the hands beginning to move toward the barn. The ordinary sounds of a morning starting, a horse, a door, someone saying something that made another person laugh. Ethan picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "I'm going to want everything you found," he said. "Every piece of it, organized so I can show it to someone in town. I'll have it ready by this afternoon." He nodded, then quietly, "You found this because you were careful." "I found this because I was looking," she said. "I was looking because this is mine now too." The word landed between them. Not aggressively, not as a claim or a challenge, just as a fact. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Then, "Yes," he said, "it is." He picked up his hat and went to work. Clara sat at the table with the ledgers and the list and the morning coming in through the kitchen window, and she thought about a Tuesday 3 miles from Red Valley, standing in a store with flour on her apron, while a man made himself feel large by making her feel small. She thought, he knew nothing about what I could do. She thought, a lot of people don't. She pulled the ledger back toward her and kept working. Rollins didn't deny it. That was the thing Clara hadn't fully prepared for. Not the confrontation itself, which she'd expected to be ugly, but the particular way it unfolded. Ethan brought him into the main room on a Thursday afternoon, with Clara's organized papers on the table between them, and Rollins looked at the pages for a long moment, and then looked at Clara with an expression that was not quite hatred and not quite shame, but something in the uncomfortable territory between them. "She put this together," he said. Not a question. "She did," Ethan said. Rollins sat back in his chair. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something harder. He'd been on this ranch 4 years. He knew where everything was. He knew how everything worked. And he had apparently decided at some point that this knowledge entitled him to something beyond his wages. "Amounts are small," he said, finally. "They add up," Ethan said. 4 years of good work. 4 years of good work and 6 months of theft, Clara said. She kept her voice even. Those aren't the same ledger. Rollins looked at her again with that expression that she was beginning to understand was specifically for her. The look of a man who had decided she had no standing in this room and was having trouble adjusting to evidence that he was wrong. With respect, he said, and his tone made clear he meant almost none of it. This is between me and Blackwood. My wife found it, Ethan said. My wife documented it. This conversation is happening because she was thorough enough to make it impossible to ignore. So you'll speak to her the same way you speak to me. The room went very quiet. Rollins left the ranch 2 days later with his wages minus the documented amounts and a written accounting that Ethan filed with the county seat. He didn't cause a scene on his way out. Whether that was dignity or calculation, Clara couldn't tell. And she didn't spend much time trying to figure it out. What she did spend time on was the remaining hands and how they'd receive what had happened. She asked Ethan about it that evening. They'll know by morning, she said. Word moves fast in a bunkhouse. It does. Some of them will think you fired him because of me, because I pushed for it. Ethan considered this. Does that concern you? It concerns me that they might resent me, specifically. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Rollins was here 4 years. Some of them probably liked him. Some of them probably knew what he was doing and let it go, Ethan said. That's its own problem. Either way, I have to work with them. You've been working with them for 12 days. It's different now. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? The question still caught her slightly off guard, not because it was unusual for a husband to ask his wife's opinion, but because of the particular way he asked it, like her answer was going to determine something real. Nothing dramatic, she said. I just want to show up the same way I have been. That's usually the most effective answer. He nodded. Then do that. She did. The morning after Rollins left, she was in the yard at the same time she always was, checking the water troughs before the heat built. Diego was near the barn, and he gave her a look when she came around the corner, assessing, not hostile, and she gave him a nod and asked about the east fence repair, and he answered her directly, and they went from there. By the end of that week, the atmosphere had shifted in a way she didn't try to name or claim. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was something more functional than that, a kind of acknowledgement that she was present, that she knew what she was looking at, and that she was going to keep showing up. The younger hand, whose name she'd finally learned, he was called Pete, barely 19, from somewhere in New Mexico, started leaving the barn log on the kitchen table in the mornings, which she understood was his way of telling her he'd noticed she read it. She made a note of a loose shoe on one of the bay mares and put it back on the table. Pete fixed the shoe without being asked. Mrs. Crenshaw, for her part, had decided that Clara's presence in the kitchen was acceptable, so long as Clara didn't try to reorganize anything without asking first. Clara reorganized nothing without asking first. What she did do was sit at the kitchen table in the evenings while Mrs. Crenshaw cleaned up and listened to the older woman talk about 11 years on this ranch, and what it had been like before and after Ethan's brief first marriage, which had ended badly in ways Mrs. Crenshaw described in careful, partial terms that told Clara more than a full account might have. He was different after, Mrs. Crenshaw said one evening, drying a pot with the focused attention of someone talking about something they hadn't talked about in a while. Pulled in. Not mean. He was never mean. Just absent, in a way. Like he decided to put most of himself into the land and keep just enough of the rest to get through days. How long ago was that? 7 years. Clara said nothing for a moment. What was she like? Mrs. Crenshaw set the pot down. Beautiful, she said, with the particular flatness of someone using a word that contains more information than the word itself. Knew it thoroughly, came out here thinking it would be something other than what it was. Lasted 8 months. She picked up another pot. Ethan never said much about it. Never said much about most things. Clara thought about the man who sat across from her at dinner and asked questions and listened to answers and said less than he observed. He says enough, she said. Mrs. Crenshaw gave her a sideways look. More than he used to, she said, and went back to her pots. Warren Hale came to the ranch on a Saturday, which Clara had started to understand was the day when social calls of a particular kind arrived, the kind that were not quite friendly and not quite business. He came with two of his men and a bottle of whiskey he presented to Ethan in the front room while Clara poured coffee and listened. Warren Hale was not what she'd expected from Doris's husband. He was smaller physically, a compact, neat man in his late 50s with a careful smile and the kind of eyes that moved constantly, taking inventory. He talked about cattle prices and the county water agreement and the drought forecast for the coming summer with the fluency of someone who lived inside these subjects. And then, smoothly, he said, "Heard you had some trouble with your supply accounts." Ethan looked at him. "Word gets around," Warren said pleasantly. "I hope the situation was resolved." "It was," Ethan said. "Good. Good." Warren sipped his coffee. These things happen when operations get too large for one person to manage alone. I found that the key is having the right people in the right positions, people with experience in these matters. A pause. "I have a man, Garrett, been with me 12 years, who handles all my accounting. I'd be happy to have him consult with your operation, as a courtesy." Clara set down the coffee pot. She said, "That's generous, Mr. Hale. The accounts are currently being managed, but if anything comes up where we need outside consultation, we'll be sure to consider that offer." Warren looked at her. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it recalibrated. "Of course," he said. They talked for another hour. Warren was skilled. She could see that clearly. Nothing he said was overtly offensive. Every offer was framed as neighborly generosity. But the architecture of what he was building was legible to her, a gradual positioning of himself as essential, as the man who knew how things worked and could help, as the person Ethan might naturally turn to when things got difficult. What he had not accounted for was that the thing he was offering to provide was already there. When he left, Ethan stood at the window watching the horses move down the road. "He wants something," Clara said. "He always wants something." Ethan didn't turn around. "That's Warren. Everything's a negotiation." "What does he want specifically?" "Water rights." Ethan turned. "There's a creek that runs along the eastern border of my property. His land is dry in summer without it. He's been working toward an arrangement for 3 years. A pause. "He wants me to feel like I need him before he asks." Clara thought about that. "And do you need him?" "No," Ethan said. "But the water situation is real. The county agreement runs out in 18 months. What happens when it runs out?" "We negotiate a new one, or we go to court, or Warren and I work something out privately." "Which does he prefer?" "Privately," Ethan said. "Because privately, he has more leverage." Clara thought about the account ledgers, about how much she could read in numbers when she knew what to look for. "Do you have the existing water agreement documented?" she asked. He looked at her. "In the study. Why?" "Because I'd like to read it," she said. "Before the next time Warren Hale comes to visit." The water agreement was 43 pages of legal language that had been drafted by a county attorney 12 years before, and Clara spent 3 evenings with it at the kitchen table while the lamp burned down. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman who had kept her family's accounts and contracts since she was 17 because no one else was going to do it. She understood documents in the practical way of someone who had once read the fine print on a creditor's notice at the age of 19 and found the clause that gave them an extra 60 days. A clause her mother would never have found because her mother didn't believe in reading things carefully. What she found in the water agreement was not a crisis. Not yet. But it was a seam. A place where the language was ambiguous enough that a skilled attorney could argue it either way. And she had a feeling Warren Hale's skilled attorney had already found it. She brought this to Ethan on the 3rd evening, setting the relevant pages in front of him with the passages underlined in pencil. "Here," she said, "and here." He read. He was a faster reader than she'd expected. He moved through legal language without the slow tracking she'd seen some men do, losing the thread of what they were trying to parse. "I see it," he said. "If he argues this section as establishing a proportional use right rather than a fixed boundary, then he has a claim to increased access during drought conditions," Ethan finished. He sat back. "I've had this agreement for 12 years and I never caught that." "You weren't looking for it." "He was." "Almost certainly." Clara sat down across from him. "You need a lawyer to look at this before the agreement period ends. Someone you trust, who isn't connected to Warren's interests. There's a man in Callaway County. He handled my father's estate. Ethan's expression was the contained kind again. She was learning to read it as a sign that something had hit a nerve he wasn't going to perform about. I should have done this before. You do it now, she said. That's what matters. He looked at her for a moment. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. She didn't know quite how to take that. Is that a problem? She asked. No, he said. It's not. He looked at the pages again. It's just, I've been running this place alone for a long time, thinking of it as mine to manage alone. It's still yours, she said carefully. That's not what I meant. He closed the water agreement and set it aside. I meant I got used to carrying things by myself. Didn't notice how much I was carrying until someone else started sharing the weight. Clara held that for a moment. She thought about what Mrs. Crenshaw had said. He decided to put most of himself into the land. She said, I know something about carrying things alone. I imagine you do. The lamp was burning low. Outside it was fully dark, the kind of dark that only exists far from towns, absolute and unhurried. Somewhere in the barn, a horse moved. The ledgers are in good shape now, Clara said, because she was not yet practiced at sitting inside personal things, and she moved toward practical ground instinctively. Once the water question is settled, the main operational issues are the drainage repair and the supply chain for winter. Ethan watched her make this move. She could feel him watching it. All right, he said, without commenting on it. We'll get the drainage done in August when the ground is drier. I'll write to the lawyer this week. Good. She gathered the water agreement pages and straightened them and put them back in order. He watched her do it. Clara, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. I mean it plainly. Not as a formality. She held his gaze. I know you do, she said, and meant it. The letter from Nora arrived in the 4th week, and with it came news that Clara had been half expecting and had told herself she wasn't dreading. Her mother had been talking. The letter was careful. Nora was always careful, always aware of what could be read by the wrong person. But between its lines, Clara could feel the shape of what was happening back in Red Valley. Margaret Dutton had apparently told several women at the church social that Clara was struggling to adapt to ranch life, that the marriage had been practical rather than genuine, and that Ethan had already expressed regret to family friends. None of which was true. All of which was exactly the kind of story Clara's mother told when she was afraid of something and had no other tool for managing the fear. Clara sat with the letter for a while. She was in the small sitting room that had been, she gathered, largely unused since Ethan's first wife left. She'd begun using it in the afternoons for reading and accounts because the light was good and the room was quiet. She'd brought a small rug from the storeroom and a second chair, and it was slowly becoming somewhere she didn't mind being. She thought about her mother telling people Clara was struggling. She thought about the particular cruelty of being failed by someone who was also, in their broken way, afraid for you. She wrote back to Nora. She wrote the truth. The ranch was difficult and demanding, and she was tired in ways she hadn't been tired before. And the work was real and not romantic, and there were people here who had not been kind. She wrote also, I am not struggling in the way she means. I know what I'm doing here. Tell her I'm fine, and if she can't believe that, at least ask her to stop telling people otherwise. She sealed the letter. Then she sat for another moment in the good afternoon light with the rug under her feet. She was not fine in the simple way the word usually meant. She was something more complicated than fine. She was in the process of becoming something, and the process was hard and uncertain, and she had good days and worse days, and the nights were still sometimes long with the particular loneliness of someone who had married a stranger and was learning him piece by piece in a place where she had no history. But she was not failing. She was absolutely not failing. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went back to work. It was Adelaide Hale who told her, in late October, that the town was talking about her specifically. Adelaide had started coming around on her own, not with Doris, who came on formal social calls with her careful smile and her freight of ulterior motive, but independently, on horseback, in the mid-mornings when she was apparently supposed to be doing other things. She and Clara had developed an odd and unannounced friendship built primarily on the cellar drainage problem, which Adelaide's information had helped solve, and which had led to a series of subsequent practical conversations about land management that Doris would have found entirely undignified, and that Adelaide seemed to find sustaining in a way she hadn't entirely expected. My mother had people to dinner last week, Adelaide said. She was sitting on the fence near the barn, which was where she often ended up on these visits, watching Clara work through something with the supply inventory. Warren Hale's business partner was there, a man named Clifton. Clara looked up. I don't know him. He runs cattle north of here. He and Warren have some kind of arrangement. Adelaide picked at a splinter in the fence post. He said, I wasn't supposed to be listening, but the door was open. He said he'd heard that Ethan married you because he lost a bet. Clara was still for a moment. A bet, she repeated. That's what he said. Adelaide kept her eyes on the fence post. That some men in the county had a wager about whether Warren could convince Ethan to make a disadvantageous marriage, and that Ethan had been tricked into choosing you. A pause. He made it sound like it was common knowledge. Clara set down the supply ledger. She thought about the meeting at Reverend Callow's home. The 2 hours. The questions, the answers, the attention that felt unlike anything she'd experienced. The deliberate, unperformative way Ethan had explained what he was looking for and listened to who she actually was. A bet. The story required Ethan to be a fool and required her to be a punchline. Is this something people believe? She asked. Adelaide finally looked at her. She was 23 and sharp and had been taught her whole life to want things quietly. Some of them want to, she said. It's a better story than the one where he chose you because he wanted to. Why is that a better story? Adelaide considered this with the seriousness of someone who had thought about it already. Because if he chose you on purpose, it means the things they said about you were wrong. And people don't like finding out they were wrong. It's easier if there's a trick somewhere. Clara picked up the ledger again. Her hands were steady. Who is Clifton aligned with? She asked. Warren, Adelaide said, obviously. So this is Warren working on Ethan's reputation through mine. Adelaide was quiet. He wants Ethan to feel embarrassed, Clara said. Isolated. Like the marriage has made him look foolish. And then Warren comes in with his helpful offer and his 12-year man who can handle the accounts and his neighborly consultation on the water agreement. She closed the ledger. It's not stupid. No, Adelaide said. My father is not stupid. Neither am I, Clara said. Adelaide looked at her for a long moment, then quietly, I know. That's why I told you. She told Ethan that evening. She told him exactly what Adelaide had said and where the story appeared to be coming from and what she thought its purpose was. He listened without interrupting. He was standing by the window. He often stood when she was telling him something significant, as though sitting made it too easy to contain his reaction. When she finished, he said, Clifton is Warren's man, has been for years. Yes. This is Warren trying to embarrass me into pulling away from the water agreement negotiations. Make me feel like I made a mistake. Make me come to him from a weakened position. That's what I think. He turned from the window. His jaw was doing the thing she'd come to recognize, the tightening that meant he was deciding how angry to allow himself to be. I should be angry on your behalf, he said. That's what a man is supposed to say. You can be angry on your own behalf too, she said. They're calling you a fool. They're calling you worse. They've been calling me worse my whole life, Clara said. I'm still here. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but moved. What do you want to do? He asked. Nothing dramatic, she said, which is what she'd told him about Rollins and had found to be true. I want to be exactly what I am, visibly, where people can see it. When Warren's dinner comes, the one in November you mentioned, I want to be there, and I want to be ready. Ready for what? For being looked at, she said. I've been looked at my whole life. I know how to handle it. What I want is to handle it well, in front of the right people. He studied her. There are ranchers from 4 counties at that dinner, he said. Business contacts. People who make decisions about water rights and cattle contracts and county politics. I know. It's not a comfortable room even without a story like Clifton's floating around. I know that too. Ethan was quiet. Then, you're not afraid of it. I didn't say that, Clara said. I'm afraid of it. I'm going anyway. The distinction seemed to matter to him. She watched it land. All right, he said. We go together. November came in cold and fast. Clara had one dinner dress. The dark blue wool was too warm but appropriate in a way she didn't have an alternative for, and she wore it and did her hair with more care than usual, and stood at the mirror in the bedroom for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she looked like herself and then stopped looking. She was herself. That was going to have to be enough. In the wagon on the way to the Hale Ranch, Ethan didn't offer her reassurance, and she didn't ask for it. They rode in a quiet that had, over the past weeks, become a comfortable thing, not empty, but inhabited. He said once, "The county attorney is coming tonight. Name's Fenwick. He's worth talking to if you get the chance." And she said, "I'll find him." And that was all. The Hale house was large and lit warmly from every window, and there were 8 wagons outside when they arrived. Inside there were somewhere around 30 people, and Clara felt the room absorb their entrance, the way she'd felt rooms absorb her since she was a child. A ripple, quick and invisible, unless you knew what you were looking for. Doris Hale greeted them at the door with her perfect smile and her assessment eyes and said, "Mrs. Blackwood, how wonderful," in a tone that meant several things simultaneously. Clara said, "Mrs. Hale, your home is beautiful," which was true and therefore easy to say, and moved inside. She found Adelaide within 5 minutes. Adelaide pressed a glass of lemonade into her hand and tilted her head almost imperceptibly toward a man standing near the fireplace. Mid-50s, thin, with the careful expression of someone who spent his days reading contracts. Fenwick. Clara crossed the room. She introduced herself and they talked about the water agreement with a directness that surprised him and that she'd planned for. She asked specific questions, the right questions, the ones that came from having read 43 pages of legal language 3 times over. He answered them with increasing focus. The way people answer when they realize the person they're talking to is not performing interest, but actually has it. By the time Ethan found them 20 minutes later, she and Fenwick were deep in the ambiguous proportional use clause, and Fenwick was saying, "This is exactly the section we'd need to challenge if Hale pursues what I think he's going to pursue." Ethan stood beside her and listened and added one thing and let her carry the conversation. Afterward, finding a quiet moment near the window, he said, "Where did you learn to talk to lawyers like that?" 14 years of reading every contract my family signed, she said. "How many were bad? 3 that I found in time, 2 that I didn't." He absorbed this. Across the room, she could see Warren Hale watching them. His expression was the careful, pleasant kind he wore as a default, but something underneath it was different from usual. Recalibrating, she thought, like Doris had done on that first visit, but to a deeper degree. She lifted her glass slightly toward him, the smallest possible acknowledgement. He returned it. "Clifton is here," Ethan said quietly. "I see him," Clara said. "Don't worry about Clifton." "I'm not worried about Clifton," Ethan said. "I'm watching you handle a room full of people who came here expecting something different." She looked at him. "How am I doing?" she asked. He considered her for a moment, that focused, quiet attention she'd first encountered at Reverend Callow's table, and that still, after weeks, felt like something she hadn't been prepared for. "You're doing well," he said. And he said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without decoration, as a statement of observed fact. She turned back to the room. There were still hours left in the evening, still conversations to have and people to read, and the careful work of being present in a room that had not expected her. Her feet hurt in her good shoes, and the blue wool was too warm, and she was tired in the deep way she'd been tired since the first day on this ranch. She was not, however, going anywhere. She finished her lemonade, set the glass down, and moved toward the next group of people who had not yet made up their minds about her. Fenwick wrote to them in December. The letter was 3 pages, single-spaced, in the precise language of a man who understood that clarity was a form of protection. He had reviewed the water agreement in full, consulted the relevant county statutes, and his conclusion was this: the ambiguous clause Clara had identified in the proportional use section was exactly the opening Warren Hale's attorney would exploit when the agreement came up for renegotiation in 18 months. If Ethan did nothing, Warren could make a legitimate legal argument for expanded creek access during drought conditions, which, given the forecasts for the coming summers, meant essentially permanent expanded access. Fenwick's recommendation was to file a clarifying amendment with the county before the renegotiation period opened. He had drafted language. He included it. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while snow came down outside in the thin, unhurried way it did in this part of the territory. Not dramatic, just steady and accumulating. She read it twice, then put it in the file she'd been building for the water situation, which now occupied its own section of the cabinet in the study that Ethan had quietly made available to her without announcing he was doing so. She thought about the dinner at the Hale house 3 weeks before. She thought about Warren's careful, recalibrating expression when he understood she'd been talking to Fenwick. She thought about Doris's smile and Clifton's story about a bet and the specific architecture of how men like Warren Hale built their advantages, slowly, through the accumulation of small positions, each one deniable on its own. She put on her coat and went to find Ethan in the barn. He was there with Pete, looking at the gray gelding whose hoof had been the first thing she'd brought to his attention in the early days of October. The hoof had healed well. The horse was in good condition now, and Pete had developed something close to proprietary pride about this, which Clara found entirely reasonable. "Fenwick wrote," she said. Ethan looked up. He read something in her expression because he said to Pete, "Give us a few minutes." And Pete disappeared toward the back of the barn without needing to be told twice. She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, which was how he read things that mattered, and his face did the contained thing while he worked through it. "He's right about the clause," Ethan said. "Yes. I should have had this looked at when the original agreement was signed. The attorney who drew it up probably should have flagged it," Clara said. "But here's where we are." Ethan folded the letter. "Filing the amendment means Warren knows we've caught it, means open conflict. We're already in open conflict, it's just been polite so far." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory near it. "All right," he said. "We file." The filing happened in January, through Fenwick's office in Callaway County, and the response from Warren Hale came not through legal channels, but through Doris, who arrived at the ranch on a morning that was too cold for social calls, and wore an expression she hadn't bothered to calibrate into pleasantness. Clara received her in the parlor. She did not offer coffee. "My husband is very surprised," Doris said. "Is he?" Clara said. "He considered your husband a friend. Whatever legal arrangement, clarifying an existing agreement isn't hostile," Clara said. "It just makes the terms clear. If your husband's intentions are what he's always presented them as, neighborly, straightforward, then the amendment changes nothing for him." Doris looked at her. The carefully maintained surface of her expression had developed a crack, thin but real. "You're very confident for someone who's been here 4 months," she said. "I've been paying attention for 4 months," Clara said. "That's not the same as confidence, that's just work." Doris left without staying long, and Clara stood at the window and watched her ride out and thought, that conversation will get back to Warren within the hour. She thought, good, let him adjust his picture. What she didn't anticipate was that Warren's adjustment would involve something other than legal pressure. The storm came in February. It came from the northwest, which was the direction Mrs. Crenshaw said the bad ones always came from, on a Thursday night when the temperature had already dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon. By Friday morning, the wind was the kind that made sound into something physical. You didn't hear it so much as feel it pressing against the walls of the house, looking for the places where the structure wasn't quite solid. Ethan had gone to Callaway County on Wednesday for a meeting with Fenwick and had planned to return Friday. By Friday morning, it was clear he wasn't returning until the storm passed. Clara stood in the kitchen at 5 in the morning and listened to the wind and made a list in her head. The livestock, the barn structure, which had a weak point on the north wall she'd noted in November and written in the log and which no one had gotten to yet because winter had arrived before it could be addressed. The water supply for the animals, which froze in temperatures like this and needed to be managed manually. The bunkhouse, which housed 6 men and was adequately heated but not if the wood supply ran low. The main house, which was her responsibility. She put on every layer she owned and went out. Diego was already in the barn when she got there, which told her something about him she'd been filing away since October. The man showed up before he was asked when the situation was obvious. Pete was behind him, and 2 of the other hands who she'd learned more slowly because they were quieter. A man called Amos who was 40 and spoke in whole sentences only when something mattered, and a younger one named Callum who was from somewhere in the Carolinas and had not fully adjusted to Western winters but was stubborn enough not to say so. "The north wall," Clara said to Diego. "I know," he said. "I've got boards from the supply shed. I need another pair of hands on it." "Callum," she said. Callum went with Diego without discussion. She turned to Pete and Amos. "Water troughs, all of them, in order. Break the ice, and I want someone checking every 2 hours." In this, Pete said, not as objection, but as logistical question. In this, she said, rotate so no one's out more than 30 minutes at a stretch. She went back inside and told Mrs. Crenshaw to keep the stove at full capacity and to have hot food and coffee available continuously, not at mealtimes, because this was going to be a long day, and men working in cold needed to eat when they could. Then she put her shoulder to the problem of the livestock. There were 40 cattle in the south pasture that needed to be moved closer to the barn. They'd been left out because the weather had been mild enough, but mild enough was no longer the situation. She couldn't do it alone. She went back to the barn, took the horse she'd been using for ranch work, a steady roan mare named Bess, who did not enjoy weather but was sensible about it, and spent 2 hours in wind that made her eyes water and her hands ache, moving cattle toward shelter with the help of Amos, who said nothing the entire time and worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this before. When they got back to the barn, her face was numb. Amos looked at her while he was rubbing down his horse and said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "You don't look it." "I'm fine." She started working on Bess. "How's the north wall?" "Diego will have it covered before noon if the wind lets up enough to work." "And if it doesn't?" Amos was quiet for a moment. "Then we do it in the wind," he said. "Well, the north wall held. It held because Diego and Callum spent 4 hours in the worst of the storm bracing it with timber and nails and a particular kind of determination that Clara understood came from men who'd been on ranches when walls hadn't held and knew what that looked like. By early afternoon, the structure was sound enough that she stopped worrying about it and turned her attention to the water supply, the fuel supply, and a problem she hadn't anticipated. One of the cattle she'd moved in the morning was showing signs of cold stress, standing apart from the others with her head low and her breathing wrong. Clara was not a veterinarian. She was a woman who had grown up adjacent to animals and who had, in 4 months on this ranch, made it her business to learn what she didn't know. She'd read the animal care logs going back 3 years. She'd watched Diego and Pete handle minor injuries and illness. She knew enough to know this cow was in trouble and not enough to be certain what to do about it. She brought Pete, who was 19 and from New Mexico, and had, it turned out, grown up on a cattle operation considerably smaller but more practically hands-on than the Blackwood Ranch. Pete looked at the cow for 2 minutes and said, "She needs to get warm, like inside warm." "We can't bring a cow into the house," Clara said. "Tack room," Pete said. "It's insulated. We could get the temperature up with a second lamp." Clara looked at the tack room, small, full of saddles and equipment, but enclosed and out of the wind. "What do we move?" she asked. "I'll move it," Pete said. He did. He moved a season's worth of gear into the adjacent space and got the cow into the tack room with a patience that Clara found remarkable in a 19-year-old. And by evening, the animal's breathing had settled into something closer to normal. She told him he'd done well. He went red in a way that was visible even in the lamplight and said, "She's a good cow." "She is," Clara agreed. "Keep checking on her tonight." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was the first time anyone on the ranch had said that to her, and she was almost to the door before she registered it. Ethan came back Saturday afternoon when the storm had passed enough to make the road manageable. He came into the barn first, which was where Clara was doing an accounting of what the storm had cost them, and he stopped just inside the door and looked around at the space, at the cattle that had been moved, at the repaired north wall, at the tack room where a cow was recovering on clean straw, at Pete sitting nearby with a proprietary expression. He looked at Clara. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it, in order, the way she always gave him information, sequentially, without editorializing, letting him form his own conclusions. The north wall, the cattle movement, the cow, the water rotation, the fuel management, what each person had done and how they'd done it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Losses?" he asked. "None. The cow is recovering. The wall will need a permanent repair in spring, but it held." She paused. "We were close on the wall. If Diego hadn't started when he did." "But he did." "He did." Ethan looked at the north wall, at the fresh timber bracing visible against the older wood. Then he looked at Diego, who had just come in from outside and was stomping snow off his boots. "Good work," Ethan said. Diego nodded once. "Clara had it organized by 6 in the morning," he said. "We just did what she told us." He was going to say something. He didn't say anything. But his face did something she'd only seen it do a handful of times. Something open and unguarded, underneath the ordinary surface of it, like a window with the covering pulled back. She looked away first because she didn't know yet how to hold that. The story of the storm got into Red Valley by the following week, the way stories always got there, in pieces, carried by different people, assembled into a version that may or may not have resembled what actually happened. What Clara heard through Adelaide was that the version circulating in town described her as having panicked, and that Ethan had returned to find the ranch in chaos. Adelaide delivered this information with the tight expression of someone who found it personally offensive. "Where did this come from?" Clara asked. "Clifton was in town," Adelaide said. "I don't know how he knew anything about it, but he had a version. He knew because Warren has connections here. Someone who heard something from someone." Clara thought about it. "It doesn't matter. The hands know what happened. The hands aren't the ones talking in town." "Not yet," Clara said. She was right. It took another week, but Diego came into Red Valley for supplies and got into a conversation at the dry goods store that touched, as conversations in Red Valley tended to, on the Blackwood Ranch and its new occupant. And Diego was not by nature a man who argued or performed, but he was a man who stated facts when facts were relevant. And what he stated in a store with enough people in it to make the information move was this: that when the storm hit and the boss was away, Mrs. Blackwood was in the barn before sunrise, and when she left it, everything had held. He said it once. He bought his supplies. He left. Clara didn't hear about this directly. She heard about it 3 days later from Mrs. Crenshaw, who had heard it from the woman who ran the post office, who had gotten it from someone else. By the time it reached her, it had the quality of information that had been tested against other information and found more durable. She was in the kitchen when Mrs. Crenshaw told her. She kept her face still, but her chest did something that was not the tightening she'd been managing her whole life. It was different. It was the feeling of something releasing rather than something held. March came in muddy and necessary, the way springs do in ranch country. Not pleasant, but vital. Everything that was frozen becoming something that could move again. Clara's days had developed a rhythm she no longer had to consciously impose. The logs, the accounts, the supply orders, the ongoing correspondence with Fenwick about the water amendment, the gradual work of understanding what the land needed and what the operation could provide. She had also, slowly and without planning it, learned the people. Amos had a daughter in Callaway County he didn't talk about but wrote to every week. She'd noticed the letters going out in his handwriting, always on Sundays. When she learned, through an unrelated conversation, that the daughter was sick with something ongoing, she said nothing direct but made sure Amos was given the time off he needed when he needed it without having to ask. He said thank you once, in the particular way of a man for whom those words cost something, and she understood that was the whole of what would be said on the subject. Pete had ambitions he was embarrassed about. She could see it in the way he read the ranching almanacs he kept in the bunkhouse and the careful questions he asked when he thought they were just practical. She started giving him more responsibility with the livestock records, not as charity, but because he was good at it and getting better. He didn't know how to accept this at first, and then he figured out how. Callum was homesick in the way young men are when they don't admit they're homesick, and Clara made no particular accommodation for this, except to listen when he occasionally talked about North Carolina in the way of someone who hadn't decided to leave yet, not entirely. Sometimes listening was the whole of what a person needed. Diego she understood least and trusted most. He was 40-something and private and competent in the way of someone who had worked many places and learned what worked, and kept only that. He had decided, somewhere around the time of the storm, that Clara was worth working for, and this had shifted something in the whole dynamic of the operation in a way that was real even though no one spoke about it. She was thinking about all of this on a Monday morning in late March, when a wagon came up the road that she didn't recognize. It was a good wagon, not ostentatious but well-maintained, with a team of matched bays that told her something about the owner's priorities. The man who climbed down was in his 50s, well-dressed in the way of someone who had money and didn't need to announce it, with a square face and steady eyes. He introduced himself to her in the yard. "Daniel Mercer," he said. "I ranch about 40 miles north. I'm in the area for the county livestock meeting, and I've been wanting to call on Blackwood." "He's in the south pasture," Clara said. "I'm his wife. Come inside and I'll send Pete to get him." Mercer looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating expectations. They sat in the parlor, and Clara asked about his operation, and he answered and asked about hers, and what developed in the next 45 minutes. Before Ethan arrived, still wearing his work coat, slightly out of breath from hurrying when Pete had told him who was there, was a real conversation, the kind where both people were actually interested in the information being exchanged. Mercer, it turned out, was one of the 4 ranchers on the county water committee. I was also, Clara gathered, a man who had heard the various versions of the Blackwood marriage story circulating in the territory and was drawing his own conclusions from the evidence of this parlor conversation. When Ethan arrived, Mercer stood to shake his hand and said, "Your wife just explained your position on the Creek Amendment better than your letter to the committee did. You should let her write the next one." Ethan looked at Clara. She kept her expression neutral. "I'll consider it," he said. The county livestock meeting was in April in Red Valley, which meant that Clara was going to be in her hometown in a public capacity for the first time since the wedding. She understood, without needing anyone to tell her, that this was the moment a certain kind of test would be administered. She dressed carefully. Not in her best dress. The blue wool was too warm for April and too obviously her best. But in a dress she'd had made in March from fabric she'd chosen herself, dark green, well-fitted, without ornamentation. She put her hair up properly. She wore the small pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. She looked in the mirror and saw herself. She stopped looking. In the wagon on the way to town, Ethan said, "Mercer will be there, and Fenwick, and 3 of the other committee members." "I know," she said. "Warren will also be there." "I know that too." A pause. "How are you feeling?" She considered the question. He asked it the same way he asked practical questions, directly, without the softening people usually put around personal inquiries when they were afraid of the answer. "I'm all right," she said. And then, because he deserved more than the simple version, "It's strange to go back somewhere that has a very fixed idea of who you are. It's strange to know the fixed idea is wrong and also know it won't change easily." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter to you?" he asked. "What they think?" "It matters less than it used to," she said, "which is different from not mattering." He nodded. She looked at the road ahead. "Does it matter to you?" she asked. "What they say about us?" "About whether I was tricked into marrying you." "Yes." "No," he said, flat and certain. "What matters to me is the water amendment and the cattle contracts, and whether the north wall needs to come down and be rebuilt or just reinforced. What matters to me is what's actually real." He glanced at her. "You're real. That's not in question." She kept her eyes on the road. She thought, this man says very little, and almost none of it is wrong. The livestock meeting was held in the town hall, which was a large enough space for the 40-odd people who came from the surrounding area. Ranchers, their wives, county officials, a few merchants whose livelihood depended on the agricultural operation of the region. Clara had been in this building hundreds of times in her life. She knew where the loose floorboard was near the back left row. She knew the way the ceiling leaked when it rained hard from the east. She walked in with Ethan and felt every head in the room process their entrance. She had prepared for this. She had been preparing for it in some ways since she was 12 years old, standing in rooms that turned to look at her and finding ways to keep standing. What she hadn't prepared for was her mother. Margaret Dutton was near the back of the room with a woman named Frances Cook, who was her closest friend and her primary audience for every story she had ever told about her own life. Margaret saw Clara come in, and her face did a complicated series of things in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, then something that might have been pride or might have been a calculation of how pride could be useful, then the careful, pleased expression of a woman who had decided on the narrative she wanted. Clara made herself cross the room. "Clara," her mother said, "you look well." "Thank you, Mother." Margaret's eyes moved to Ethan, who had followed. "Mr. Blackwood." Very proper. The tone of someone meeting royalty they'd previously only heard about. "Mrs. Dutton," Ethan said. "It's good to meet you." Brief and courteous. They shook hands. Margaret said something about the ranch, and Ethan answered it. Clara stood between them and felt the old familiar weight of her mother's needs pressing against the newer, stranger thing her life had become. And she breathed through it and was polite, and then, when Mercer appeared at Ethan's elbow with a question about the committee agenda, she moved. "Excuse me, Mother," she said, and went. She found a position near the front of the room where she could see everything and be seen, and she stayed there through the opening of the meeting and the first hour of business. And she talked to the people who talked to her, and listened to the people who didn't seem inclined to, and took in the architecture of who was aligned with whom, and what the real questions under the official agenda were. Warren Hale was 3 rows over, and he looked at her once, early, and she looked back, and that was the extent of it for the first hour. What happened in the second hour was not something she had planned for. The agenda reached the water rights discussion, the county creek allocations for the coming year, the status of existing agreements, the upcoming renegotiation periods. Fenwick's amendment filing had been noted in the agenda materials and was brought up by the committee chairman, a rancher named Stokes, who was methodical and impartial in the way of someone who understood that impartiality was his professional value. Warren Hale asked to speak. He was good. She had known he would be good. He spoke about the history of the creek agreements, about neighborly cooperation, about the drought forecasts, about the importance of flexibility in water management. He did not mention the Blackwood Ranch by name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew what the amendment was about and whose interests were on which side. He made his case, and it was skillful, and it had the advantage of sounding reasonable to anyone who hadn't read 43 pages of legal language 3 times. Stokes asked if there were other comments. Clara did not look at Ethan. She stood up. The room shifted. She was not a committee member. She was a rancher's wife at a public meeting, which meant she had the standing to speak if the chair permitted it. She looked at Stokes. "If the committee has a moment for a non-member comment," she said. Stokes looked at her with the assessing expression of a man who had not expected this and was deciding quickly. He looked at his notes. He looked at the room. He said, 2 minutes, Mrs. Blackwood." 2 minutes was enough. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage or make the thing personal. She spoke about the specific language in the proportional use clause, in plain terms that anyone in the room could follow, and about what that language would mean in practice under drought conditions, and about what the amendment proposed, and why it simply made the existing intention of the agreement legible. She cited the clause number. She cited the relevant county statute. She said, "This is not a change to what the agreement was meant to do. It is a correction of language that obscured what the agreement was meant to do." 2 minutes. She sat down. The room was quiet in the particular way of a room that is just recalibrated. Warren Hale was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful pleasantness, not the recalculating assessment, something older and less managed. Mercer, 3 seats to her left, said, "That was well put," quietly enough that only she and the people immediately around her heard it. Stokes called for a motion on the committee's position on the amendment. She breathed. The motion passed. Not unanimously. Warren had allies, and they voted accordingly. But it passed by enough that the committee would formally support the amendment filing, which meant the county record would reflect the clarified language before the renegotiation period opened. Outside, afterward, in the April air that was still cool enough to feel clean, Ethan stood beside her on the steps of the town hall while people moved around them. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You cited the clause number." "I memorized it," she said. "When?" "In December, when I first read Fenwick's letter." He looked at her sideways. "I didn't know you were going to speak," he said. "Neither did I, entirely," she admitted. "But the moment was there." He was quiet. Then, "You were right to take it." She nodded. They were standing on the steps of the building where, for 26 years, she had been one version of herself, the version that Red Valley had decided on. She was aware of people nearby, aware of her mother somewhere in the crowd behind them, aware of Warren Hale moving toward his wagon with the particular economy of motion of a man absorbing a setback. She was also aware of Ethan beside her, solid and unhurried, not performing anything. "I want to go home," she said. He looked at her. "To the ranch," she said. "I want to go back." He nodded, and they walked to the wagon, and the town of Red Valley watched them go, and Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead the way she always did when she knew the road was taking her somewhere she actually wanted to be. They were 2 miles out when he said, "You know this isn't over with Warren." "I know." "He's going to find another angle." "He will," she said, "and we'll find it before he does, the same way we found this one." Ethan was quiet for a stretch of road. "You said we," he said. Clara kept her eyes on the road. "Yes," she said, I did. The horses moved steadily. The sun was low and the light was the long golden kind that made the landscape into something that looked almost like it was worth all the trouble it cost. The ranch was another mile ahead, invisible still but there, as real and present as anything she had ever worked toward. She was tired, her feet hurt. She had a headache from the close air of the town hall and from the sustained focus of 2 hours of managing a room while managing herself. She was also, underneath all of it, something she had not been in 26 years of living in that town. She was winning, not cleanly, not without cost, but moving forward, with ground underfoot and someone beside her who saw it the same way she did. That was enough for today. Warren Hale found his next angle in May. It came through the cattle contracts, which Clara had not been watching as closely as the water situation because the water situation had seemed like the more urgent front. That was, she understood later, exactly what Warren had intended, that her attention would be concentrated in one direction while he worked in another. The cattle contracts for the Blackwood Ranch had been managed for years through a buyer named Slocum, who operated out of Callaway County and handled sales for several of the mid-sized operations in the territory. Slocum was not dishonest in any dramatic way. He was simply a man whose loyalties were, at the end of any given season, available to the highest bidder. And Warren Hale, who understood that Ethan's water position had just been strengthened, had apparently decided to strengthen his own position through a different door. What Clara found, again at the kitchen table, again in the early morning before the house was fully awake, again because she had been reading things that were available to be read and that no one else had been reading carefully, was that Slocum had agreed to a preferential pricing arrangement with the Hale operation that effectively put the Blackwood cattle in a secondary position for the fall sale. Not excluded. Just lower priority, slightly worse terms, the kind of disadvantage that compounded over seasons into something significant. She found it in a secondary ledger that Ethan hadn't mentioned and that she'd come across while reorganizing the study in late April. It wasn't hidden, it was just unfiled properly, the way things accumulated in operations that had been managed by one person carrying too many things alone for too long. She sat with it for 2 days. On the second evening, after dinner, she put it in front of Ethan. He looked at the relevant pages. He looked at them again. His jaw did the tightening she knew well by now. "How long?" he asked. "At least 2 seasons. Possibly 3. "And you think Warren arranged this?" "I think the timing matches his pattern," she said carefully. "I can't prove the connection, but Slocum shifted his terms for Blackwood cattle within 6 weeks of the water amendment filing." Ethan set the pages down. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the wall for a moment, and Clara let him look because she'd learned that he needed space to process things without being prompted toward a reaction. "I've worked with Slocum for 9 years, he said finally. "I know. He's never been a problem." "He probably didn't consider it being a problem," Clara said. "He probably considered it being practical. Warren has more volume. Warren offered better terms for Slocum's own business. From Slocum's perspective, he was just making a business decision. At my expense." "At our expense," she said. "Yes." Ethan looked at her. There was something tired in his face that she didn't often see there, but not defeated, but the specific fatigue of a man who has been managing things alone for so long that he's built his picture of the world around what he can manage, and is now confronting the limits of that picture. "How much does it cost us?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like a man testing whether he could hold the weight of the number. She told him. He was quiet. "All right," he said. "What do we do?" She'd been thinking about this for 2 days. "We need another buyer. Not as a replacement necessarily, but as a parallel option that gives us negotiating position with Slocum. I've been looking at what Mercer does. He works with 2 buyers, alternating by season. It gives him flexibility that single buyer operations don't have." "You've been talking to Mercer about this?" "I've been corresponding with him about his general approach, not about our specific situation." A pause. "He's been helpful. He's also the kind of man who would be a useful connection regardless of the buyer question." Ethan absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the information, the implication that she'd been building connections he hadn't directed her to build, the fact that those connections were already proving useful. "You wrote to Mercer," he said, "in March, after the livestock meeting." She kept her tone even. I should have told you I was doing it. No, he said. You shouldn't have to report your correspondence to me. He paused. I'm adjusting, still, to this being a thing we do together. So am I, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said, and she believed him. She wrote to Mercer formally, this time with Ethan's full knowledge, and Mercer's response came back within 2 weeks with the name of a buyer he'd found reliable, a man named Aldous Crane, who worked out of the northern part of the territory and was, according to Mercer, straightforwardly honest in a way that was rarer than it should have been. Clara wrote to Crane. She laid out what the Blackwood operation produced, its scale and quality, the volume available in the fall sale. She was direct about what she was looking for: fair terms, consistent relationship, and the basic professional expectation that Blackwood cattle would be treated as a primary account rather than a secondary one. Crane wrote back. His terms were good, not dramatically better than Slocum's original arrangement, but good. More importantly, they were in writing, which Slocum's arrangement had never been in any form Clara could find. She put the correspondence in the water amendment file, which had become, over the months, a more general operational security file. She'd started thinking of it as the document of what the ranch actually was versus what it was assumed to be. Ethan read Crane's letter over her shoulder one morning and said, "You asked him specifically about the written contract. Agreements in writing are more useful than agreements in good faith," she said. "I've worked on good faith for 20 years. I know, and it's mostly worked." She straightened the letter. "But good faith depends on the other person's faith also being good, and you can't always control that." He was quiet for a moment. "You learned that the hard way." "My family did, yes." She put the letter in the file, twice. He didn't ask for more than that. Understood, she'd come to realize that she gave information in the amounts that were useful and held the rest not out of secrecy, but out of the long habit of a person who'd learned to be careful about what she offered, and to whom. She was getting less careful with him, slowly, in pieces. He seemed to understand that too. June brought heat and a different problem, and the different problem had a name: Doris Hale's Summer Gathering. It was an annual event. Clara gathered this from Mrs. Crenshaw, who had a comprehensive and slightly acerbic knowledge of the social calendar of the surrounding territory. Doris hosted a late June gathering that was nominally a women's social, but functioned, in practice, as a sorting mechanism for the community's female hierarchy. Who was invited? Who was not? Who sat where and talked to whom, and left with what impression of what kind of woman they were dealing with? Clara had been invited. "Is that unusual?" she asked Mrs. Crenshaw. "New wives generally get an invitation the first year," Mrs. Crenshaw said. "It's how Doris looks them over properly." A pause. "Also how she decides where they'll land." "Where I'll land." "There's the women who are Doris's, the women who are independent, and the women who don't matter enough to categorize." Mrs. Crenshaw stirred something on the stove. "You won't be the third. The question is which of the first two." Clara thought about Doris's living room in October, about the recalibration behind the careful smile, about Adelaide, who had become something genuine and was treated by her mother as a minor asset to be deployed strategically. "And if I don't attend?" she asked. "Then you've answered the question yourself," Mrs. Crenshaw said, "and not in a way that helps you." Clara went. She drove herself, which was the first small declaration. She didn't need Ethan to bring her, and she didn't need to arrive as a rancher's wife who required escorting. She arrived in the middle of the gathering rather than the beginning, which gave her the advantage of seeing the room already in motion before she entered it. There were 12 women. She knew 3 of them: Doris, Adelaide, and a woman named Ruth Pierce, who had been at the livestock meeting in April, and who had watched Clara's 2 minutes at the podium with an expression that Clara had filed as interested rather than hostile. She greeted Doris first because that was correct, and then moved through the room the way she'd learned to move through rooms, with specific direction, not hovering, not performing comfort. She didn't feel. She found Ruth Pierce near the window, and they talked about the water situation, which Ruth had views on because her husband's operation was also downstream from the Hale property, and had, she said with the bluntness of someone who had stopped softening things, been affected by the same creek access issues for 3 years. "Your amendment going through the committee," Ruth said, "that was useful for more than just your ranch." "I know," Clara said. "That's partly why it needed to go through." Ruth looked at her with the assessing expression of someone who had been watching people for a long time. You're not what the stories said. What did the stories say? Several things. A pause. None of them particularly accurate from what I can see. They rarely are, Clara said, about most people. Ruth smiled. Not the careful managed kind, but the real kind that used a person's whole face. No, she said, they're not. They talked for another 20 minutes. By the time Doris gathered everyone for the formal part of the afternoon, tea, small food, the kind of facilitated conversation that was really facilitated observation. Clara had also spoken at length with two other women she hadn't known before, both of whom had operations of their own and views about county water policy that were specific and informed. Doris watched all of this with her inventory eyes. When Clara was leaving, Doris found a moment at the door that felt arranged, though Clara couldn't have said how. You've settled in, Doris said. I have, Clara agreed. Warren says the cattle contract situation will resolve itself in the fall. Clara looked at her. Doris's expression was perfectly neutral, a woman passing along information without any implication at all. I imagine it will, Clara said, equally neutral. Most things do, one way or another. A pause. Something moved through Doris's expression that was so quick Clara almost missed it. Something that was not warmth, but was in the same neighborhood. Respect, maybe. The reluctant kind. My daughter speaks well of you, Doris said. Adelaide is sharp, Clara said. You know that. Yes, Doris said. Something in the word was more complicated than agreement. I do know that. Clara drove home through the June afternoon with the windows of the wagon open and the smell of the land in the air, and thought about Doris Hale, about the particular position of a woman who had spent her life managing a world built by her husband's ambitions and who had become very good at the managing and very confined by it. She thought, that could have been me. A different version of this, with a different man, doing a different kind of managing. She thought, I'm grateful it isn't. The fall sale came in September. Crane proved to be exactly what Mercer had described, straightforward and fair, with the practical efficiency of a man who had built his business on repeat relationships rather than single transactions. He was at the ranch for 2 days to assess the cattle before the sale, and he and Clara went through the livestock records together while Ethan handled the physical assessment with Diego, and what emerged was a clear and accurate accounting of what the Blackwood operation had to offer. Crane bought at fair price. He wrote the contract in duplicate. He shook Clara's hand as well as Ethan's when he left. Slocum, who had heard through the channels that moved information in cattle country that Blackwood had engaged another buyer, sent a letter in August that struck Clara as the kind of communication that was really a question disguised as courtesy. He hoped the relationship would continue. He valued the long partnership. He was prepared to discuss terms for the coming season. She drafted the response herself and showed it to Ethan before sending. It's polite, Ethan said, reading it. It's polite and clear, she said. We're happy to maintain the relationship on terms that reflect the actual value of our account. That's all it says. It's also saying we know what happened. Without saying it, she agreed, which leaves him the option of correcting course without anyone having to have an ugly conversation. Ethan set the letter down. What if he doesn't correct course? Then we have Crane, she said, and by next season we might have a second alternative as well. He looked at her. You're already working on a second alternative. I've been corresponding with someone Mercer mentioned. She paused. I was going to bring it to you when it was further along. He was quiet for a moment in the way that she'd learned could mean several different things, and she waited. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I should have... No, he said. That's not what I was going to say. He picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands. I was going to say, I need you to know that I trust your judgment on this. Not just the outcome, the process, the way you're doing it. He looked at her. I was a man who made every decision alone for a very long time, and I'm still sometimes treating this like that's the situation. It's not. I know it's not. I just don't always show that I know it. It was the most he'd said about it directly. She held the words carefully because they deserved that. I know, she said. I don't always make it easy. I move ahead on things because I'm used to working alone too. She looked at him. We're both still learning how to do this. Yes, he said. We are. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the September evening was coming in purple and cool, and from the barn she could hear the sounds of the operation settling into its nighttime rhythms. Hooves, a low voice, the familiar creak of the building adjusting to the temperature change. She thought about October a year ago. A room full of strangers and a letter from a man she hadn't met yet, and her mother saying, with the brutal practicality of fear, no one else has asked. She thought about what she was sitting inside now, and how entirely she had failed to predict it. October brought the anniversary of the letter, and it brought Warren Hale's final move. She had known something was coming. She'd known it the way she knew most things, through accumulation, through the reading of small signs that individually meant little and together meant a direction. Warren had been quiet since the livestock meeting, quiet in a way that felt like preparation rather than retreat. What came was public, and it came at the worst possible time, and it came in the form of a letter to the county committee that was somehow also read aloud at the Red Valley Merchant Association meeting, which Ethan attended on the third Thursday of October. The letter was from Warren Hale, and it questioned the Blackwood Ranch's water amendment on grounds that Clara had not anticipated, not on legal grounds, which Fenwick had secured, but on moral grounds. It stated with the careful language of a man who understood that accusations required deniability, that questions had been raised about the circumstances of the original Slocum contract termination and whether the new buyer arrangement had been made under conditions that constituted a breach of the county business conduct agreements. This was, on its face, absurd. There was no breach. They had ended an informal arrangement and engaged a new buyer. This happened in cattle country constantly and required no justification. But the letter also said, in its final paragraph, with a gentleness that was the cruelest part of it, that some members of the community had expressed concern that the management changes at the Blackwood Ranch over the past year had not always reflected the best judgment of its owner, and that when significant business decisions were driven by personal rather than professional considerations, the results could be damaging to the broader community's trust. Personal rather than professional considerations. His wife's management decisions. That was what it meant. Ethan came home that evening, and Clara knew from the sound of his boots on the porch, different from usual, harder, that something had happened. He put the letter on the table without speaking. She read it. She read it twice. She set it down. He did this in public, she said, at the association meeting, 40 people. He read it aloud? He had Clifton read it. She understood the precision of that choice. Warren's distance from the performance. His deniability. Clifton as the instrument. What did people say? She asked. Ethan sat down. He looked exhausted in a way he didn't often look. Mixed. Mercer pushed back immediately, said it was outside the committee's jurisdiction and that the business conduct agreement didn't cover private buyer contracts. Ruth Pierce's husband said he'd heard nothing but sound management from the Blackwood operation all year. He paused. Some people said nothing, which is its own answer. And what did you say? He looked at her. His eyes were the same as always, steady, observant, holding more than they gave away. But underneath that was something she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror. The face of someone who had been hit in a place they thought was protected. I said the management decisions at our ranch reflected my judgment, made with full knowledge and approval. His voice was flat. I said the suggestion otherwise was false. And after that? After that I left, he said, because I didn't trust myself to stay. She understood that. She sat with it for a moment. He's trying to separate us, she said. Make you feel like I've made you look weak, like you've been managed by your wife and it's cost you standing. I know what he's doing. Is it working? She asked. Ethan looked at her steadily. No, he said. It's making me angry. That's different. What do you want to do? He was quiet for a long moment. I want to answer it publicly. Not through Fenwick, not through legal channels. Publicly, where the accusation was made. That's a risk, she said. I know. If you go back at him publicly and it becomes a protracted conflict, Clara. He stopped her. His voice was still flat, but something underneath it had shifted. There are things I've let slide for 20 years because fighting them didn't seem worth the cost. Warren working on my business through my wife's reputation is not a thing I'm willing to let slide. He looked at her directly. He made it personal. I'm going to answer it personally. She thought about the October of a year ago, about Harold Finch in the dry goods store and the tightening in her chest and the years of skills she'd developed to survive rooms full of people who made themselves larger by making her smaller. She thought, this man is about to do something for me that no one has ever done. She thought, don't be so grateful you stop thinking clearly. If you respond publicly, she said, I want to be there. I wasn't going to suggest otherwise. And I want to speak. He looked at her. He made the accusation in front of 40 people, she said. Your answer addresses your position. But the accusation about management, about whose judgment is whose, that's an accusation about me. I should answer it. A long pause. It's a harder room if you speak than if I do, he said. I know. Some of them want the story where you've overstepped and I've been made a fool of. If you speak, you're giving them the opportunity to believe it more. Or I'm giving them something to look at directly instead of a story someone else constructed. She held his gaze. I've been managing this from the outside of rooms all year. I'd like to try from the inside. He considered her for a long moment. The lamp was burning between them on the table, and outside the first real cold of the season was coming down, and somewhere in the ranch the sounds were the familiar nighttime ones she'd learned in a year of living inside them. All right, he said. The opportunity came sooner than they'd planned for it. Stokes, the committee chairman, called a special session 2 weeks later to address what he described as concerns raised about the county business conduct framework, a formal way of saying that Warren's letter had created enough noise that it needed to be addressed officially or it would keep circulating informally. It was held at the town hall, the same building, the same loose floorboard near the back left row. They arrived together. They sat together, at the front, which was Ethan's deliberate choice and which Clara appreciated for its clarity. Warren was there with Clifton and 2 of his other men. He looked at Clara when she came in, and she looked back and she thought, you made a mistake when you made it about me, because I've been preparing for rooms like this one my whole life. Stokes opened the session and laid out the procedural framework with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted this to be resolved and not to explode. He invited Warren to address the committee. Warren spoke for 10 minutes. He was good, as always. He framed everything in terms of community concern and responsible process. He never said Clara's name. He never had to. Stokes invited Ethan to respond. Ethan stood. He was not a performer, and he didn't try to be one. He spoke in the plain, direct way he did everything, and what he said was this, that the business decisions at the Blackwood Ranch over the past year had been made by him, informed by his wife's thorough knowledge of the operations accounts and contracts, and that the outcome of those decisions had been better management, a secured water position, and a cattle sale at fair terms. He said that if this constituted questionable judgment, he would need someone to explain specifically what the question was. He sat down. Stokes asked if there were additional statements. Clara stood. The room went the particular quiet it went when it wasn't expecting something. She didn't perform anything. She was past performing. She was a woman who had kept her family's books at 17, who had read 43 pages of a water agreement until she knew it by number and clause, who had been in a barn before sunrise in a February storm moving cattle in wind that made her eyes water, who had spent a year learning everything about a piece of land and the people on it because it was hers, and she took that seriously. She said, the question about management in that letter referred to my management. I'll address it directly. I manage the accounts, the contracts, the supply records, and the operational documentation of the Blackwood Ranch. I do this because I'm capable of it, and because my husband recognized that capability before most people in this room had met me. Every decision that came from that management, the water amendment, the buyer diversification, the supply chain corrections, was made with full discussion between my husband and me. If anyone in this room believes that a woman managing the books of her family's ranch constitutes a governance problem, I'd be interested to hear the argument made plainly, without the language of concern and community and professional considerations. A pause. If that argument isn't being made plainly, she said, then what we're discussing is not a business question, it's a personal one. And personal questions about my fitness as a wife and a ranch manager have been circulating in this county for a year. I've done my best to answer them through the work. I'm answering this one here, where it was asked, so there's no ambiguity. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Mercer, in the 3rd row, said quietly but clearly, well put. Ruth Pierce said, seconded. Warren Hale was looking at her with the expression she had been waiting to see. Not the careful pleasantness, not the recalibration, but the face underneath all of it, stripped of its management for just a moment. The face of a man who had pushed against something he'd believed was soft, and found it wasn't. Stokes cleared his throat. He looked at his papers. He said that the committee would take the statements under advisement, and that no action on the business conduct question appeared to be warranted based on the evidence presented. He moved to adjourn. Afterward, outside, the October air was sharp and real. Adelaide appeared at Clara's elbow. "That was—" she started. "Don't say brave," Clara said. Adelaide stopped. "Necessary," Clara said. "It was necessary." Adelaide thought about this. "All right," she said. "Necessary, then." Ethan came to stand beside Clara, and they watched the committee members move toward their wagons, and Warren Hale speak briefly with Clifton and then walk away without looking back. "It's not over," Ethan said. "No," Clara agreed, "but it's different now." "Different how?" She thought about it. "Before today, the story he was telling about us required us to stay quiet for it to work. We've stopped staying quiet." She watched Warren's wagon move down the road. Men like Warren don't stop, but they adjust to what's in front of them. What's in front of him now is different from what was there in September. Ethan was quiet. Then, what's in front of him now? She looked at him. "Us," she said. He held her gaze, and something in his expression did the thing it did sometimes. The window opening, the unguarded thing underneath the ordinary surface, and he let her see it this time instead of looking away. "Yes," he said. "That's right." They walked to the wagon together, and the town of Red Valley watched them go, and Clara thought about a woman who had stood in a dry goods store a year and a half ago, with flour on her apron while a man made a joke at her expense and felt the fist in her chest clench and slowly open. She thought, you learn to survive rooms, and then, if you're very stubborn and very lucky, you learn to change them. The ranch was 7 miles out, and the road was good, and the evening was coming in cold and clear. She picked up the reins. She drove home. Warren Hale submitted a formal withdrawal of his committee letter in November. It came through Fenwick's office, which was how Clara knew it was real, and not a tactical retreat designed to be reversed later. A formal withdrawal through legal channels meant it was documented. It meant Warren had calculated the cost of continuing and found it higher than the cost of stepping back. It meant something had shifted in his assessment of what he was up against. Fenwick's note accompanying the withdrawal was brief. The water amendment would proceed without further contest, and the cattle contract matter had been closed without finding. He suggested a follow-up meeting in the new year to finalize the renegotiation language before the existing agreement expired. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and then sat with it for a while without moving. She was not triumphant. She had learned over the past year that the feeling people expected after a long fight, the clean, lifted feeling of having won, was rarely what actually arrived. What arrived instead was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of tired relief. The particular stillness of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact takes some adjustment. She put the letter in the file that had grown, over 14 months, into a comprehensive document of what this ranch was and how it worked and what it had faced and what it had done about those things. She closed the cabinet. Then she went to find Ethan. He was at the north wall of the barn, which was finally getting its permanent repair. The February storm had made the temporary bracing hold, but everyone agreed it needed to be done properly before the next winter, and Ethan had decided to do part of the work himself, which Clara had come to understand was his way of processing things. He thought with his hands. When something was resolved, he fixed something physical. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him work for a moment before he heard her. He looked up. She held up the letter. He read it standing with the nail still in one hand. His face did the contained thing, and then slowly, underneath it, something else. Not quite relief either, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a weight so long, he's forgotten the weight is there until someone takes it. He handed the letter back. "Fenwick did good work," he said. "Fenwick had good material," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent. "Yes," he said. He did. He went back to the wall. She stayed in the doorway for another moment, watching him work, and thought about something Mrs. Crenshaw had told her in those early weeks. He decided to put most of himself into the land and keep just enough of the rest to get through days. She thought about the man she'd met at Reverend Callow's table, and the man who had read the water agreement with a nail in his hand just now, and the distance between them. Not a distance he had traveled alone. She went back inside and started on the supply orders for December. The new year brought Nora. She came on a Tuesday in January with a small trunk and a letter from their mother that Clara read and set aside without showing Ethan. The letter was Margaret Dutton being Margaret Dutton, a mixture of news and complaint, and the specific brand of backhanded acknowledgement she deployed when she couldn't quite bring herself to say she had been wrong. I hear people speak well of you now. Clara had filed it under things that were as good as they were going to get and moved on. Nora came because she'd been offered a position teaching at the school in Callaway County and needed a place to stay for a month while she arranged her housing. She came also, Clara understood, because she wanted to see what her sister's life actually looked like. She saw it. She saw Clara at the kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning with the logs and the accounts. She saw her in the barn with Diego talking about the spring cattle plan, with the specific language of someone who had learned that language from the inside rather than from a book. She saw her at dinner with Ethan, the two of them going over the Fenwick correspondence without performance, the way people who work together go over things, directly, sometimes with disagreement, always with the assumption that both people's reading mattered. On the third evening, Nora sat with Clara in the small sitting room after dinner and said, "You're different." "Different how?" Clara said. Nora thought about it. "You used to hold yourself like you were expecting to be hit," she said, "like you were always slightly braced." She looked at her sister. "You don't do that anymore. Not here." Clara considered this. She thought about the fist in her chest, the reflex she'd developed over 26 years, the tightening and the slow release. She thought about when she'd last felt it. "I still do it in town," she said honestly. "Yes, but not here." "No," Clara agreed. "Not here." Nora looked around the small room, the rug, the second chair, the books Clara had arranged on the shelf that Ethan had put up in February without being asked, having noticed that she stacked books on the floor because there was nowhere else to put them. "He's good to you," Nora said. Not a question. "He is," Clara said, "not in a simple way, but in a real one." Nora nodded slowly. "That's the better kind," she said. Clara smiled. It was the kind of smile she didn't have to manage. "Yes," she said. "It is." In March, Adelaide Hale told her that Warren had stopped talking about the Blackwood Ranch entirely. They were at the creek that ran along the eastern border, the creek that had been at the center of 14 months of legal and interpersonal combat. And Adelaide had ridden out to look at the drainage improvement that Ethan's crew had finally finished in January. She had an interest in practical land management that Doris continued to find baffling, and that Clara had quietly begun to encourage by lending her books and including her in conversations with Mercer when he visited. "He's moved on," Adelaide said, looking at the new drainage channel. "He does that. When something isn't working, he abandons it and finds the next thing." "What's the next thing?" Clara asked. "He's been in correspondence with some people north of Mercer's territory. Something about a rail connection." Adelaide picked up a stone and turned it over in her hand. "He's not a man who stays defeated. He just changes direction." "I know," Clara said. "I don't expect this to be permanent." "Then what do you expect?" Clara looked at the creek, at the water running clear and steady in its proper course, the banks solid from the drainage work, the eastern pasture, beyond it already showing the first thin green of early spring. "I expect it to keep being what it's been," she said. "Work, attention. Not assuming anything is settled until it's documented and signed." She paused. "And I expect Warren to be Warren. That's not going to change." "Probably not," Adelaide said. She threw the stone into the water and watched the rings spread. "Do you ever wish it were simpler?" Clara thought about this honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "but simpler usually means something's been hidden rather than resolved. I'd rather see the actual thing." Adelaide looked at her sideways. "Even when the actual thing is difficult?" "Especially then," Clara said. "Difficult things don't improve from being ignored. I learned that a long time ago." They stood at the creek for a while longer. The water moved and the morning was cool, and somewhere behind them the ranch was making its ordinary sounds, which Clara had long since learned to hear as something other than background noise, as the sound of a thing that was real and ongoing and partly her responsibility. She thought about a woman who had stood in a dry goods store with flour on her apron and heard a man laugh and felt the world decide what she was worth. She thought about how many years she had spent being defined by other people's inability to look past the obvious surface of her. She thought, I am not that story anymore. I haven't been for a while. But it took getting here to know that, and getting here took everything I had. It was Ethan who said it first, and he said it in the plainest possible way, which was the only way he ever said things that mattered. It was April, their 1-year anniversary of the wedding, though neither of them had mentioned this as such, and they were in the study after dinner. She had the Crane correspondence laid out for the fall sale planning, and he had a land survey map spread across his side of the desk. They worked in the same room more often now. The study had become a shared space in the way the small sitting room had become hers, and the barn office had always been his, and the kitchen was Mrs. Crenshaw's, with visiting rights extended to both of them. He put down his pen. She looked up. I want to tell you something, he said, and I'm going to say it badly because I'm not good at this kind of thing. So bear with me. She set down her pen too. She gave him the full attention she gave things she needed to understand. I chose you because Reverend Callow told me you were capable and sensible, and that the town didn't see you clearly, he said. And I thought, that's a practical starting point. That's something to build on. He paused. What I didn't understand when I wrote that letter was what I was actually choosing. She waited. I've been on this ranch for 20 years, he said. Managed it, built it up, lost some of it, and rebuilt. I know what I have here. I thought I knew what I needed. He looked at the desk, then back at her. I didn't know I was missing a person, not just someone to help run the place. A person. Someone who sees things the same way I do. Not identical, we don't agree on everything. We disagree fairly regularly, she said. We do, he said. And that's... He stopped. Tried again. What I'm saying is that this year has been the least alone I've been in a very long time, and that's not about the accounts or the water agreement or any of it, though all of it matters. It's about you specifically. It's about who you are. He looked at her directly. I'm grateful you said yes. I know you took a risk. I know the town gave you reasons to doubt it. I want you to know it wasn't pity. It was never pity. It was the best decision I've made in years, and I knew it before the end of the first week. The study was quiet. The lamp was burning steadily. Clara held what he'd said. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over everything she needed to get right. I knew by the first week, too, she said finally. Not that it would be easy, but that it was real. She looked at him. I've spent most of my life being told what I was worth by people who hadn't looked closely enough to know. You looked closely, from the beginning. A pause. That's not a small thing. That doesn't stop being important just because a year has passed. He held her gaze. No, he said. It doesn't. They stayed in the study for another hour. They went back to their work. The lamp burned down and she refilled it, and he made a small joke about the survey map being less accurate than her memory of the land, which she argued with on principle and conceded on fact. And by the time they went to bed, the night was full and cold, and the ranch was quiet. She lay in the dark and thought, this is not the life I planned. I didn't plan any life, actually. I survived the life I had and hoped for something better. She thought, better is a word that doesn't cover this. Mrs. Crenshaw retired in June. It was not a surprise. She'd mentioned it in March, then April, then finally said in May, with the tone of someone who had made up their mind and was telling the relevant people in order. She had a sister in Callaway County. She hadn't seen properly in 4 years, and she was 64, and her knees were communicating their perspective on the subject of standing all day over a cook stove. Clara organized a proper send-off. She cooked herself, which she'd been doing increasingly anyway, and she invited Diego and Pete and Amos and Callum and a few of the other hands, and they sat in the kitchen and ate, and Mrs. Crenshaw told stories about the ranch that went back 11 years, and some of them were funny, and some of them were not, and all of them were true. At the door, leaving, Mrs. Crenshaw held Clara's hand for a moment. You changed things here, she said. Not loudly, but thoroughly. Clara said, you held things together for 11 years before I got here. I kept them the same, Mrs. Crenshaw said. That's different. She squeezed her hand and let go. Keeping things the same is its own kind of courage. But you do something harder than that. She didn't say what that was. She didn't need to. Clara stood at the door and watched the wagon carry her down the road, and the June morning was clear and warm, and behind her the kitchen smelled like the meal she'd cooked, and the ranch was fully in its summer rhythms, loud with life and work, and the ordinary demanding noise of a place that was running well. Diego came to her in August with a question she hadn't expected. He came in the way Diego did everything, directly, at the relevant moment, without preamble. He had a man he wanted to recommend for the second-hand position they'd opened with the summer expansion. The man was someone Diego had worked with before, competent and reliable. That was standard. What wasn't standard was that Diego came to her with the recommendation and not to Ethan. She noted this without commenting on it. She looked at the man's background. She asked Diego 3 questions and listened to his answers. She said she'd discuss it with Ethan and they'd decide together. Ethan, when she brought it to him, said, "Diego came to you first." "He did." Ethan nodded. He didn't say anything more about it. He read the man's background and agreed with the hire. But she thought about it later, about what it meant that Diego, a man who said only what was necessary and had worked on ranches his whole life and understood hierarchies the way you understand water, just as something that runs downhill, had walked past Ethan's barn office and come to find her. Not because she was the boss's wife, because she was the person he had worked with through a February storm and a thieving hand and a year of operational decisions, and he had formed his assessment, and she was where he went with things that mattered. She had not arrived here. She had built here, piece by piece, in the only way anything real gets built. The 2nd October came, and with it, the renegotiated water agreement. Fenwick had done the work carefully, and the new language was clear. No ambiguous proportional use clauses, no interpretive gaps, explicit terms for drought conditions that protected the Blackwood Creek access without being punitive to downstream operations. Warren Hale signed it through his attorney without comment. The county committee recorded it without incident. Clara filed her copy in the cabinet. She stood at the cabinet for a moment after she filed it. The drawer was full now, a year and a half of documented work, organized and labeled in the system she'd built from scratch, in the first weeks when she'd been learning what this place was. Contracts, correspondence, accounts, land records, livestock logs, the Rollins documentation that had led to everything that followed. She closed the drawer. Ethan was behind her. She'd heard him come in, recognized his walk the way she'd come to recognize everything about the rhythms of this place. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He stood beside her at the cabinet. He put his hand over hers briefly, and she turned hers to hold it, and they stood there for a moment in the ordinary afternoon light of the study that had once been his alone and was now theirs. She thought about the things that were true and that she would not have predicted. That a letter from a stranger could be the beginning of something real. That capability recognized by one person, clearly and without performance, could change the shape of a life. That a town's opinion of a woman and a woman's actual substance could be so entirely different from each other that the distance between them felt sometimes almost absurd. That loneliness is something you can be so accustomed to that you stop calling it by its name. And that its absence, when it finally comes, feels less like arrival and more like breathing out. She thought about 26 years of being told what she was by people who hadn't earned the right to say. She thought about flour on an apron and a man's laugh in a store and the fist in her chest that had learned to open slowly. She thought, that woman is still me. She didn't disappear when the circumstances got better. She became this, something that includes all of that, the years of it, the cost of it, the stubborn daily work of it. And here's what she understood, standing in a study with her hand in her husband's hand. In a ranch she had helped build into something better than it was. People will tell you what you are worth before they know you. They will do it casually, as Harold Finch did in a store, as a small town does with its collective eye. They will build a story about you from the surface of you and live inside that story comfortably for years. This is not a thing that stops. It is a thing that you learn to outlast. What outlasts it is not beauty or charm or the approval you earn from proving yourself dramatically in a single moment. It is the accumulation. It is every morning you show up to the work, every ledger you read carefully, every question you ask when you don't know, and every answer you give when you do. Every room you walk into braced and walk out of still standing. Every person you treat with the fairness that no one is required to treat you with, not because it comes naturally and costs nothing, but because you have decided it is who you will be. Clara Blackwood had not become someone else. She had become, more fully, herself. And the self she had become was more than the town of Red Valley had ever looked closely enough to see. They saw it now. Not all of them. Not with grace, and not without the various adjustments and recalibrations that people make when the story they've been telling turns out to be wrong. Ruth Pierce saw it and said so directly. Mercer saw it and acted accordingly. Adelaide Hale saw it and was, in quiet ways, changed by it. Became a woman who asked her own questions and offered her own knowledge and stopped waiting for permission to be capable. Some of the others would take longer, some never would. That was the reality of it, and Clara had stopped requiring otherwise. What mattered was the file in the cabinet and the water running clear in the eastern creek and the cattle that had wintered well and would sell well in the fall. What mattered was Pete, who was 20 now and managing the livestock records with a confidence he'd earned and knew it. What mattered was Amos's daughter, who had recovered enough to come visit in September and who sat at Clara's kitchen table and ate Mrs. Crenshaw's successor's cooking. A younger woman named Bet, capable and learning fast, and talked about her father with the ease of someone who knew he was valued where he was. What mattered was this: a man who had written a letter to a woman he hadn't met, looking for something practical, and had found something he hadn't known to ask for. And a woman who had read that letter in a house that had never quite fit her, and had packed a small trunk and driven 3 miles into a life that would cost her everything she had and give her more than she'd known to want. Neither of them had been looking for the other specifically. Neither of them would have written the story this way if they'd been given the choice of stories. That is almost always how the real ones work. Ethan Blackwood had spent 20 years building something alone and hadn't understood the specific weight of the aloneness until someone arrived to share it. Claire had spent 26 years being told she was a burden and had arrived, somehow, in a place where she was the anchor. He hadn't saved her. She had not needed saving. What she had needed was to be seen accurately, once, by someone who had the sense to look. She had given him something equivalent and harder to name: the experience of being known by someone who had earned that knowledge through daily attention and chosen to stay anyway. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole of it. The October afternoon was clear and cold, and the light was coming in low through the study window, and outside the ranch was making its sounds, and Ethan's hand was warm in hers, and Clara Whitmore Blackwood, the girl nobody wanted, the woman they mocked, the wife who had turned out to be more than anyone had been paying enough attention to see, stood in the middle of her life and felt, without drama and without performance, exactly where she was. Home. That was the word. After all of it, that was just the word.